All right, thanks everybody for coming today. On behalf of the AA, I'd like for us to welcome Marcelo Spina, who's coming to us from Los Angeles. He is a young practitioner and educator working out of Los Angeles with a studio that he co-runs with his wife Georgina called Patterns. The subject that Marcelo is going to be discussing with us today is a lecture that he's titled Interstitial Mass, Figural, and the Embedded. And in a certain sense, it's basically revolving around issues to deal with design research and practice, education, and so forth, as he is, as well as a practitioner and builder. He is also an educator and a writer, teaching at SCI-Arc for a long time in the design and technology faculty. And in a certain sense, he will be discussing a lot of the things that have been formalized in some form in a forthcoming monograph on the work of Patterns called Embedded that will be published by ACDCU and to be released very recently. Marcelo has been practicing and developing a series of projects, most recently a project in Los Angeles called the Prism Contemporary Gallery. He's been developing projects in China and also in Argentina. And I think in a certain sense, the lecture today is going to be very much situated and revolving around the problems of design research and looking towards issues to deal with fabrication, formalization, figuration, and design practice. So as this is the first lecture that Marcelo will be giving at the Architectural Association, this is his first ever time here, I'd like to keep this short. But if we can, please welcome Marcelo to the Architectural Association.
Thank you. It's on, okay. Thank you, Tio, for a nice and warm introduction. It's great to be here. It's a place that, as an architect, and especially an educator, you sort of learn to lab aspect and figure a little bit in terms of like what it sort of meant in terms of its presence, the amount of history, and so on. So it's especially interesting for me to be here. So this is something that is going to appear soon, and it's been the focus of our work in the last probably the last 3 years, you know, when a book starts as a kind of idea and then till it sort of concretizes itself and it's sort of in physical form, and it actually, as you know, and there's plenty of books obviously around us, it becomes a moment where you sort of, you know, to look back to work, in our case, the work for about 10 years that my partner Georgina and myself have been done, along with a number of collaborators, students, former students, and soon-to-be students, you know, from around the world, you know, mostly in the context of Los Angeles. So this is not a promotional talk about the book, but it's about to reflect some of the things that are contained in it. And as a book, normally it portrays a kind of finished part of the work, and it actually in part does that. But in this case, what's important to me is to both reflect on lineages of research that have probably concluded through the realization of some key build projects, and also lines of research that sort of begin and the potential tension in between those as actually as you move further. So the book is both, you know, a kind of a sort of internal mechanism for us to look at it, as also a way to position it. Embedded relates to this idea of us to take really serious the need to insert ourselves in the context of both the discipline and a certain history, a certain lineage of work that preceded, and you have to understand in order to operate within it and potentially change. But also, importantly, the context of practice and what it means, and that's actually a much more sort of muddy territory that sometimes doesn't really add up. And we're interested in, at all times, sort of crossing boundaries and moving between that and transpassing territories to allow for material to actually exchange, information to, you know, move back and forth between, you know, what we teach and what we do, assuming that there's also, you know, there's a lot of differences, ethical differences in terms of what one does, but also in terms of what it, you know, what it produces. The the book and the lecture and so on is organized through in a very direct way to make a little bit of a statement, mostly related to a kind of US context of, especially an academic context, where many times theory is supposed to precede practice. And at least in my generation, or the way we always thought that this is no longer the case, that theory does not precede practice, neither practice precedes theory, but thinking and doing actually are, formulated in parallel. One of them many times taking a little bit priority, but then kind of a loop of self-reflection and critique entering the loop to be able to actually move the discussion further, move the arguments, or improve the materialization of problems. So there's a series of notes as arguments that actually appear episodically, and they don't at all precede the work. They appear in certain moments of the book in relation to projects, but they're supposedly contagious to, to the whole work, hopefully. So ever since we started, we aimed to a certain kind of materialization of the work. Interested in material, we probably will call ourselves materialists in an intention that we're interested in architecture not staying in the sort of abstract realm, but we recognize that the abstract realm is actually quite important. So whether the abstract realm is materialized itself through, sort of a powder or any kind of deposition machines that allow for your ideas to actually exist on physical form and yet still maintain a certain virtuality, because there's everything can be done through those means. And it's a way to actually test their physicality when it appears outside of that sort of virtual realm, and then begin to kind of explore other variations where you have to do with either conditions of finishes, where the things begin to acquire a different kind of physicality, they're more specific, and then scales begin to mutate, where the material becomes more material that is scalable to building material, closer to prototypes, exploring issues of composites, plastics, or also much more conventional materials and processes like aluminum or concrete, and how these things begin to affect and mutate the work, and how that actually, if you transpose either at scales up, begins to take on complete different conditions where building systems or construction, have an impact on what you do. And we're interested in getting through all these phases and beginning to understand how these things work to potentially feedback, not to overly constrain the work, but certainly to be able to jump fences and to, just acquire certain expertise in what you do. Not to overly repeat yourself, but engender some kind of cohesion as you move further. And hopefully that cohesion traduces itself in a kind of in a sort of internal mechanism for the work. So this is, so far, it's a little bit of a conversation with ourselves and how you actually assess all that, and what can, how much control you have, what sort of lineages begin to appear in the work, things that you're conscious, lineages that are interesting, and lineages that sometimes you begin to drop, families that you're no longer related, and families that are, nonetheless interesting and important, but you want the work to kind of, move from, and families such as this one, which are probably more present, let's say. The relation between abstraction and materialization is really important, and that sort of tension you'll probably see. So I'm going to just make a small digression, which had to do with this, probably the problem of being a young architect and the kind of control around one's own work, and the kind of control you have with institution of power around you, and how much you're able to either work within it, subvert, hopefully be able to outmaneuver, things that are more powerful than what you are, and sometimes get your work done, and or be able to, not because of the work or the building per se, but because of what that means in terms of making a statement in a way that actually has a kind of a lasting properties, and relevance, in contemporary practice, but also in history. So the point, and this is probably the point that relates more to the title of the lecture, and one of those points has to do with Figural, with basically the problem of interstitiality, which goes all the way from politics, with there's a quote of Homi Bhabha that relates to the, the sort of the nationness, the idea where existing in between things, they're interested of either working between sort of form and finance, or conditions of how to position yourself. But also, it's important for us in terms of the design techniques and certain sensibility of like surrounding yourself with certain constraints. Sometimes are existing, sometimes are completely self-imposed, so as to produce something that will actually exist in a kind of in a state of transition, in between things. But hopefully that in between, and there's obviously a context for that in terms of architecture or projects that resonate, begins to acquire a different power, where it's not just a state of anomaly, but it rather begins to be a kind of new structure for projects. Sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's external, sometimes it's, it happens to a certain degree and it's completely localized. And sometimes it's actually takes over the project and hopefully explores not only issues of abstraction and geometry, all the way to, issues of sensibility, atmospheric, and sensations. So the first project I'm going to show is a for an observation tower in Dubai, which is located on a little bit on the outside of a sort of more build-up area, and relates a little bit to this idea on sort of outer interstitial aspects, where the constraints are pretty much set up by answering the brief where supposedly a new icon had to be produced on this city of icons, and we wanted to do something where it will not be based on an overall composition, at least of the scale of the tower, and rather this will be probably the last image you will see as a designer, and it will be the effect of situations such as this. The intention was to play with the multiplicity of chords in vertical elevation, and mostly dealing with the dilemma that this thing has almost no mass, and you're supposed to bring people to a certain level that they can see a city and produce a platform there, and you could try and go around, but then everything that goes between the ground and that level is mostly something you add. And so we wanted to say, well, that's actually a problem, let's actually deal with that, and instigate what would be a drastic contrast between sort of generic cast-in-place systems that have certain constraints, and they will be super functional, the vertical chords, and parts that will be highly specific, customized, pliable, and they will be made out of composite plastic, many of them actually built off-site and transported on the side, be able to customize and so on. All this with a certain kind of a constraint relation that the geometry also relates to the pliability of the material. So even if these things don't get built, there's already a material ability and material constraint embedded into it right from the outset in a way. In order to produce something like this, where there's not an intention to completely fuse one system onto the other one, and accepting that there is a certain limit to which material can be forced, and even to oppose your own tendencies on the work, which you'll be seeing later on, especially on the build work. So there's this bridge gels that connects and structure the cores, and they should be built on a sort of composite plastic condition. They will be tessellated, and they'll actually have 3 different colors that, by position them in neighboring situations like this, begin to actually reflect and reflect from each other, creating these sort of interesting gradients that we're interested in producing, and yet not completely painting the gradient onto it. And so the problem of figuration goes from the aspect of the overall mass of this, as it goes through the sort of minimum approach to opening, aperture, from issues of seeing to also issues of just the sort of figuring and complicating the relation of the single shells. These things are platforms inside where you can actually move, and inside the kind of dynamism to move through the tower and get a kind of different views of the city, and produces this sort of manifold environment as you actually approach that from below. And then produce this condition of distortion when you're in, that allows hopefully a sort of vision of the city which is much more dynamic and through movement. And so this is not just formal games that only sort of express themselves, they're also hopefully behave in such a way. So mechanical escalators are aligned with certain lines of trajectories that ultimately make the central course where the surfaces, the subtle surfaces begin to unfold. In a complete different way, a similar set of, and a complete different context as well. This is a project competition for a National Museum of Norway in Oslo, in one of the main fjords. This is City Hall right there, and there's another fjord where there's an Snohetta project recently finished. So this is a big block that was supposed to empty, and it was supposed to be filled with a new museum, and 2 government office buildings that were supposed to be included in the competition, but not really. You're not meant to really design them. They will be designed by somebody else, but they have to be included in the master plan. And those 2 existing buildings were, part of the kind of important brief. And this is a kind of an interesting project because it really had all the condiments that we are interested in to be able to begin to play in this sort of in-between effects. Kind of like project like Le Frenois by Schumi, who's always been a kind of interesting project of like doing something in between the complete tabula rasa or the kind of contextual approach to a problem. And so as a museum, we wanted to engender something of a space like the space that the Beaubourg produces in Paris, where you have this sort of plaza that you get to experience and enjoy the culture of the museum, not only just by being inside, but by being in a kind of in a sort of almost like a plinth in front of it. And so the intention of the project was to move all the circulation towards this is an encyclopedic museum, which is my experience sometimes a little bit like extensive and boring as you actually approach it. So we wanted to answer the brief, but also come up with our own brief in terms of what it means to do a building like this in this context for the public. A public that sometimes stays at the edge because the museums are expensive and so on. This is at least the US experience. So by pushing all the circulation into the outside, we allowed that to begin to be almost a construction scaffolding for all these surfaces that, while the building canopies and cantilevers over the existing buildings begin to take over that and sort of absorb the building into a kind of the existing buildings into a larger complex, while producing this interstitial space that is yet the center of the whole space. So you will have this experience where you're like outside the museum, and other kinds of culture will be participating of hopefully the museum experience by seeing the movement, through the stairs, taking pics through the museum, and hopefully even engendering a kind of voyeurism, back and forth between several kinds of public in a way. That's the context. There is a very almost like accommodating response to the problem of mass in terms of a context, to try to almost like completely fit in, to allow for this thing to work much more locally and also at a complete different scale. So the problem of coloration and also similar intent to materialization implies that there is a certain response which is almost like generic and off the shelf to the envelope of the building when it actually is more normative. In this case, either cast in place concrete or something that would be rough and not so articulated, and a complete sort of tessellated, we thought about like even ceramic tiles that will take on color, coloration, and gradients, that it actually produces this almost baroque surface underneath of this canopy that will both sort of foster difference and between the new and the old, and allows this thing to behave in a kind of in a sort of inviting way. And yeah, so there's obviously a structure for it based on some large shear walls and a big grid shell on the top, and this thing behaves also programmatically to try to actually allow this thing to work by positioning the 2 most public programs, such as library and cafe, at 2 opposite ends. So foster that people will actually have to move and use the circulations less in a functional manner and more in a processional way, where it becomes a whole spectacle of it. So the idea of not separating form and program, or mostly activity, not so much program, is quite important in what we do. All these surfaces are obviously producing certain tension. They produce a maximum degree of distortion with a minimum amount of means. They're usually made with straight lines, and this is something we're interested in. I'll explain later why. But they tend to produce a lot of useless spaces in one side, where they produce a really fantastic experience on another. So in dealing with this from the interior, it implies that you have to either assume a lot of poché is going to appear, and this is an important problem that we are currently dealing with, which implies a little bit of separation and a little bit of a breakage between, let's say, ideas of continuity, mostly started within modernism, and continue on by some work of art contemporary. So the two surfaces are not parallel, and you have basically them produced in different conditions. And our intention was to really play with this radicality of worlds, where, let's say, you have a really articulate and almost sculpted interior right on the back of the facade for contemporary art, and then you have a completely neutral, almost generic set of galleries that curators can actually govern and conquer in any manner. And this is a problem of many of these projects today, where you have less and less control over the galleries. And so there's a sort of elephant in the room, which has to do with certain formal tropes and certain techniques that obviously we must manifest and self-impose a constraint to explore, and have obviously some kind of sequence of research, and have to do with saddle, surface, minimal surface, and a little bit of hyperbolic paraboloid. And there's obviously a history of this, which we're actually quite aware and interested in, from people like Felix Candela in Mexico. It's the Church of Sagrada Milagrosa, where the use is very much, and all Candela's work about like producing structuration and producing plastic effects by adopting this thing and trying to do everything with this. Almost like he tried to make a foundation out of subtle geometry once. More anomalies like at Corbusier and Xenakis, which is obviously an important precedent for us because they're much less rationalized and structural means in producing something like this, and the effect is really a kind of a spatial experience, and not to try and produce everything with subtle geometry. And obviously the tectonic means, although this is obviously a pretty old project, you're still having an incredible amount of trouble when you actually have to build these things, no? And how the partition of these and the means of making are usually separated, but they could may as well be related to their tectonic condition. Or even somebody, a less known figure like Miguel Fisac in Spain, using something where the thing behaves in a completely different way at a kind of in a vertical level, and the features that this thing produces. So we see it differently, and the use of the surfaces is a little bit different, obviously, that the precedents in terms of that they're neither like everything we do is going to be done with the same palette of tools, and not to be like overly dogmatic about it. Let's say that this is going to change the world, or like everything should be topologic, or everything should be used, everything you use this geometry. Not to completely isolate these things as like anomalies or moments of fracture that only just happen a couple of times because it will look good. And so the intention was a little bit to retrospectively map the appearance of these things, and in doing so begin to produce diagrams that will engender new things. So in the case of Oslo, these things are obviously internal. They don't define the mass. They appear as almost like webworks. They defy the nature of the structure of the ordering, and they produce zones of interstitiality, and yet they could easily be removed, let's say, in a diagram like this, not in the mass. In the case of Dubai, these things are obviously constrained, but they are actually externalized, and they produce these shapes. So they have a larger gravitational field in terms of what they do. And obviously this is within the scope. And in projects like this, which I'm not talking about, they basically are the only thing, as a source of both structure, organization, and expression. There's obviously a limiting range of these things, and they produce a certain kind of continuity, which at some point becomes like tiring and becomes like a form of a cliche. So in looking further, there's this family which is associated with it because it uses similar techniques, but it doesn't produce surfaces, it produces solids. It's called Sallow Polyhedra, and it's basically a way of representing primitives in a different form by using these surfaces. In many cases, this thing is closed, not always, but but we're much more interested in the closing possibilities of that to create a form of relation between these two things, which are no longer so dramatic. This is something that is actually going on right now. This is a project that is under development. So I thought, since there's build projects that are finished, and I will show you a kind of a project that is very much on the making. I'm going to play this little animation, which is probably a bit low res, but it may be, it sort of works. Hold on. Anyway, yeah, it's a project for the city of Henderson in Kentucky, state of Kentucky, on the Ohio River, and it has a number of features. But what I think is it begins to change what we are doing in relation to how sort of figuration appears not only at the level of mass and at the level of fenestration, but also begins to kind of permeate the whole field through which both the project it's managed, and forget that the music is not really for this kind of thing, but anyway, and but how, let's say, those sort of figures allow for a kind of a much more loose condition of the project. It's assumed to be actually quite dynamic in terms of certain formal determinisms, in terms of a plinth that surrounds an existing building that allows a facility, and that the state and the city wants to like rectify and make, and actualize without necessarily changing into this sort of whole green tendency, because they're still very much able to produce things. So our intention was to accept a certain determinism by having a hotel on one side and a convention center on the other, and allow this this figuration to play at two levels. One in a sort of two-dimensional or almost two-dimensional part that begins to permeate the podium and allows for a number of figures, local and kind of more global, and edges and outlines and situations of breakages and extensions, for a restaurant and a cafe to exist like overlooking the river, even an auditorium. So it's like a sort of pliability existing within the matrix. And then the two masses, one of the hotel and the other one of the large ballroom, to come out of it, almost like boulders that underline the existing building, and they're neither like a straight box, not a complete topologic form, but they begin to kind of swerve and change and take on life. So similar way, there is a sort of tension between kind of more off-the-shelf generic systems that are usually associated with flat geometries, and things that are a bit sort of more swerve. And so I'm not going to stay much, but there's obviously a kind of side aspect to all these, and hopefully these techniques are not just a way of us to only making things more complex, but they work at trying to basically to allow more permeability and more different zones of public use and so on as the project develops and over time. And again, these things produce an incredible amount of either voluptuousness on a certain aspect of the mass, and a certain amount of uselessness in terms of like how like more hardline aspects of program begin to adjust to to take on these things. But of course the features that these masses produce is obviously what's interesting for us, and it's what we see as being slightly different, of like not completely being based on continuity, but based on articulation that is local, that it actually produces a lot of cusps, produces a lot of ridges, produces a lot of seams, where one thing ends and another thing begins. And this is something we are really interested in now, and like many things, we also tend to explore it at completely different scales. So changing scale completely, this is something that in parallel we managed to do for the Austrian pavilion in the Venice Biennale, which we were invited to participate, and neither my partner and I are Austrian, but this was a different kind of pavilion curated by Eric Moss, and so it included international figures doing something or academics doing something in Austria. But the intention was to directly deal with a materiality that will be associated with this, obviously plastic, and through aggregations of this Sallow Polyhedra to produce these sort of figural solids that will express themselves, as prototypes. They will have backlight. This is called lucent saddles. And they will explore conditions of figurality, not just pure decoration, but as beginning to mix figure with assembly in a way that will be, harder to discern what's doing what. So the figures like this, the shapes like that, which obviously they probably wouldn't work exactly as building, produces conditions such as these, where with flat material these are all heat form pieces, and but they can't really heat form everything. And the intention wasn't to build it on a complete monolithic system, but accept the act of assembly as a prototype-based practice, where these things are less things on themselves for industrial design purposes, which we're not so interested in doing, but more as prototypes from potentially implementation of larger things later on, in building. So they're quite complicated things to do at a small scale, but they serve us to give us feedback at that level. There's 4 colors. This is actually done in collaboration with Treeform, where these things are not just color plastic, but they're actually resin-based plastics that actually are embedded with a textile in between that allows the color to actually have material to have a certain depth, and especially when backlight produces a complete different situation. So this is more recent. You begin to see the flickering aspect of the color at SCI-Arc, where some of these pieces are now exhibited, and the intention was to produce 3 pieces of actually something like 4 different small molds that then aggregate and propagate together to produce, separated, discrete, but it's sort of an overall atmosphere, even though the objects are discrete. Turquoise, fuchsia, sort of low gray, and some kind of soft cyan are actually combined together to produce not a straight gradient, but like this sort of subtle moments of change of color and figuration. And then scoring and other techniques that are sort of micro begin to replicate in a more divagating way what's otherwise assembly. You have 6 panels being mounted on a star that is functioning as a kind of a substructure and so on. So these are obviously things that we do with students, very much like probably you actually have here and so on. And this brings me to an important problem, which is a lot of subject of our research as well, and discussions, which have to do with the relation between the material, the objective things you do, and the effects that produces on viewers, or even on the things themselves. Problems of sensation and so on that were actually very old, and it's been written quite a lot from Deleuze to Bacon, of course, and how it implies to actually working on existing conditions or disfiguring something without completely losing a certain, and that's the work of Bacon. But also, most important, the work of this guy, his name is George Harrell. He was a Hollywood photographer, a guy who was created to invent Hollywood photography. He changed the subject matter and the act of photography, where basically movies in Hollywood would not be shown advertised through video, but it would be advertised with pictures, by taking photos like that, where he not only used light in a radically different way, but use this oily substance to almost like paint their subjects to produce this sort of sweaty kind of emotional aspect that made the picture far more relevant and produced effects that were beyond, far and beyond the object. This is John Crawford and Johnny Westmuller. This is actually the Tarzan picture, where basically the same kind of technique with the same or associated subject in a complete different position portrays a complete different aspect, either sort of sense of fear of one or the sense of relaxation. Like in both cases, like a signature of a kind of event that is about to happen or just happened. And so, without getting into the phenomenology, which is not something that I'm interested at all, the aspect of finishes, materiality, and how that plays into the kind of message one trying to convey in architecture is actually really important to us. And the kind of plastic, the aspect that finishes and so on plays into it, it's obviously central. So we had to do this project in Los Angeles. It's the only project we built there, and it was an important project for us because it concludes some of the research, or allow us to test what we were doing at smaller scales or prototypes, installations, and exhibitions into a scale of a small project. This is Sunset Strip. It's obviously an iconic space and an iconic area of Los Angeles, and it's also one of the three most expensive real estates for advertising in the world. And that not only makes it for a kind of iconicity of space, but also makes it for the architectural quality to be rather low and heavily constrained by sort of market forces that only want surfaces so they can project stuff. And we were commissioned to do mostly work on the facade of a project that was actually being built out, max out an existing house that was converted to either a retail space. This is a kind of our client ambiguous brief, or the alternative was an art gallery if he didn't get to rent it. And this coincided with the economic downturn, so luckily for us, it was actually an art gallery. And the intention was to try and broadcast as much as possible what happened inside the space to the mostly vehicular community. There's not so much, I mean, there are pedestrian activity, probably as much as you can in LA. And our intention was to try and spatialize this thing, not to kind of obviously disguise the fact that it would not be much of a 2D thing, into producing something that dynamically will engage movement in a way that will force you to at least look at something like that. And if there was art that interested you, would have to stop and look at it. And so they will broadcast that, so it would be a sort of machine of attraction, and also make the facade far more material and tectonic part of the car culture than the buildings behind it. So there's a set of like visual things that obviously control this, but it's also kind of formal and physical aspect of making this thing happen. And then the intention to try to come to terms with the existing conditions, and then test through several iterations of prototypes how this plastic, in this case 3/8 of an inch polycarbonate, could become in words of our collaborator, the first envelope to build in the US entirely of this resin-based composite, which is relatively thin and fragile to at least see it in buildings in a way. So prototypes actually were done in order to test these things, and we had the ability to customize the material and to actually inject it with metal powders that would allow it to kind of flicker like a metal and behave through like opacity levels, and also glow at night when backlight. So so this goes through a kind of series of technical tests, and which we had to like navigate as well, and rationalization of curvature and seaming and so on to attain an object like that, where basically horizontal aluminum mullions grab the panels from the front, allowing for the only kind of vestige of assembly at the kind of macro level, which was important, not to like make it entirely monolithic, and then the vertical seams are actually more disguised because of a panel-to-panel connection. And as this light changes, this thing also catches the light in a very different way, and almost like changing drastically as it sort of catches on fire when the thing becomes darker, and then the interior is rather neutral, and that was an important aspect of the brief, and we sort of enjoy doing that, even if it's something that we don't normally get to do, to play with like sort of high contrast again, with this sort of thing in the swerving surface on the front that begins to attract very different for art culture, and something that curators usually become a little bit uncomfortable with, having a sort of so-called signature building or facade for the deployment of art. Luckily now they're far happier, and everyone embraced that, and it's one of the only galleries in that area, which is usually associated with music and night clubbing and so on. So the interest in this obviously had to do with the torsion and movement, but also in the engendering of oblique conditions. So it's not about the plasticity that this thing produces as an object and in the physical experience, but also that the fact that coupled with conditions of movement and with certain articulation of adjacencies through programs and so on, it can produce and engender a much more integral experience with issues of social relation exchange and even a kind of more even conditions as strange as sort of voyeurism within that begin to break boundaries between like public and private, let's say. This is a house in Argentina. It's an earlier project that we got to explore through these things, and in this particular case, the kind of the changes begin to happen through the more conflicting area of the program, which is a swimming pool that our clients wanted to incorporate in the body of the house, in their mind more as a sort of place to go, and a kind of only through a transparent glass in our mind as a sort of physical experience that will completely activate and distort a certain area of the house, allowing the project to almost gravitate towards it and generate like physical relation, but a complete oblique directionality to it, through visuality and so on. And mostly allow people to almost like begin to kind of fall in the pool rather than like approach the pool as like something completely different. So the house is called outside a city of Rosario, which is a city my partner and I come from, and in a context that has like no context, and it's very close to the airport, and it's cast in a monolithic concrete that allows for a kind of a plaster coat at the end that allows to erase some of the imperfections or take those imperfections in a competent mode, allows people like us to be able to build and have a little bit of control and editing when things don't go that way or the way you expect. And then, of course, allows the materiality to be a little bit erased, imposes a more monolithic feeling of the space. There's another surface that actually like falls and opens back in the entry, and then a small little light well for like supposedly gardening, because that was one of the functions that the clients wanted to have, along with a greenhouse near the pool. But unfortunately, they moved to Venezuela. So this thing is a rental house. So this is as far as we got. The house is finished, but it never really got like the full life that one gets once the kind of client, especially in the domestic environment, begins to do. But our interest in this is a project very much in flows, and obviously one of the earlier projects, the families that probably is like kind of it's no longer interesting to us, because we find that the sort of complete dynamization of space doesn't really, it's just like forcing a certain behavior on things that actually have that kind of behavior. And our interest was, at this point, was obviously trying to maintain the flow. And interestingly enough, certain spaces, especially in domestic environment, have to be discrete. So the intention was to have that sort of feeling of movement or even points of light through activation of windows or positioning of windows, that you will always understand this in a kind of extended way. And even through figures such as this, or even in places like this where you can't really do much, but you still have, like, at least through a kind of more Cartesian lines, begin to understand that kind of continuity. And this one is where, like, the thing begins to work at their best, the fenestration and how it begins to kind of frame the landscape in a completely different way. And then the cascade part towards the pool, which basically makes of the complex part of fluidity of the house, contraposes a certain dimensional reading of it by producing this almost like coffers of glass that actually cascade down towards the pool. And the interior of that and the outside of this cascading thing, that allows a different reading, or hopefully kind of be able to acquire a kind of a dimensional understanding of something that is rather fluid and so on. So all this obviously can take place with the context of mass. In all these projects there is mass, but mass in some projects is it's really the most important thing. And it's something that is probably at the edge of like negotiating all the architectural foundations, systems, and ideas to certain other things which are sometimes completely abnormal or completely non-linear in relation to what you do or what you're interested in doing. From city history to the evolution of an urban fabric, to city codes, to the possibilities of labor, to financial, and so on. And we're interested in not theorize all that because it changes every time, but at least understand that mass is not the result of any kind of linear process, but it's actually a much more synthetic and sometimes like completely straightforward decision. And articulation, which is could mean completely different things, and plays a role important in almost like completely disregarding a medium scale to go from the overall scale of the mass to the scale of even a circulation, embedded circulation within a project to a scale of an opening in a way. And that's something completely conscious that we're interested in doing, to try and like almost accept the constraint and the mass to allow it to almost exist, buildings exist that are not in a kind of simple way, but in a way that will almost like embed themselves in a very easy way within the culture and context that they inhabit, and yet then deploy a complete other paradigm and a complete other set of systems that hybridizes their being and exposes a very different set of conditions. In this case, kind of a wrapping circulation around an entertainment space, in Nimbo for a master plan, including other architects, and in this case, something that kind of larger at civic space that is like hard, in terms of their massive presence, and yet has contained this sort of soft, multi-purpose atrium manifold that allows for a number of things, including sort of climatic conditioning and so on, that behaves internally. And so, in the case of Chengdu project that we finished last year, the mass was very much something that was suggested by the client and in form of a perimeter. And we didn't really have to work through it, but there was obviously a serial, almost a kind of a factory condition of what these things will be like when they were brought to the site. This is part of a 20 buildings master plan in the outskirts of Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province in central China, very close to where the epicenter of the earthquake was a few years ago. And the intention was that this building will actually exist like in a sort of a central road, and the buildings will be on the side. But this is, at least in our experience working in China, you don't really know where the building is going to be. This was the early version, that's our building. And then our building appeared second, from left. And so you had this idea of generic around you. And we wanted to like embrace that, to produce something that would be more like of an internal logic, that even if it plays anywhere, it would always, it would not depend on the outside, and it would actually take advantage of it to produce something which has always been interesting to me about the Carpenter Center, about like, even though this thing works in a fantastic way by connecting to streets and so on, there is an area that a moment where if you kind of go from one to the other, where you kind of lost track of where you are, because it actually looks the same in both sides. And this is something that was interesting to us, to sort of play with that generic to produce something that is both generic and highly specific from the beginning by intersecting this kind of a layered box with this circulation spine that works diagonally, and also with a vertical core that allows for the meeting of basically three very, very different functions. The intention of this master plan was to actually host companies that will basically wanted to establish themselves in China, or in Chengdu in this case, and instead of having to pay for their people to have offices and rent hotel, they will basically live upstairs, work downstairs, and exercise at the lower level, where they will have a sauna, a spa, and a swimming pool. So the building sort of embraces that, and does that hopefully in a way that it actually subverts some of the possibilities that the program allowed. In doing that, you have these sort of things where, like, you have to look very closely to know which ones is that, because the moments of cantilevering mass on one side and the other one are actually very similar. In fact, they're actually self-similar. Also, for what we envision to be a problem of economy. If we are going to do something that is radically different than all the other buildings, you may as well have a kind of strategy of it. And so this thing, which is a kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde working together, begins to defy some of the kind of normalcy of the slabs and the waffle slabs and obviously the public space or semi-public space for the people to this thing looking in the pool. So this is the master plan. It's like a very military thing somehow because it's heavily guarded. I don't know what happened because the buildings are really empty. There are only 2 buildings occupied, and everything else is actually waiting to take on the client. And our building is called On Their Mind, Eye of Time. It's an interesting thing how your projects get sort of baptized in different way, and they're usually much more savvy in terms of what I guess market demands means, and the intention is that this thing internally will behave in a completely different way. The materialization of this is important because all of the flat surfaces of the building are actually aluminum clad, very much like many of the other buildings. This is something that the client wanted somehow, and we had to sort of work. And then all the surfaces that are warp, it's the only building in this campus that actually has something that is non-planar, are done in GFRC, and they're done off-site, and they're done in complete different technology and manufacturing. So this thing that cantilevers in both sides and plays in a sort of hard way with volumes and straight edges begins to acquire sort of pliability in this moment. This is the building is 3,000 square meters, 30,000 square feet. So it depends where you look. There's not a lot of people here. It's actually relatively large, definitely the largest thing we've ever built. And the interesting of playing with this contrast is that actually at the moment it's built, and also because of the amount of dust there and so on, I guess, and the light and reflection, and because we managed to coat these surfaces with a sort of metal finish, there's almost no contrast, or the contrast begins to kind of diffuse itself. The panelization is obviously expressing the seams. These other things is expressing the sort of monolithic finish, although it's also panelized. The sides have these windows that are inset, almost in the opposite way of a bow window that allow for obviously kind of intensification of perspective and the embeddedness of other figures, while you also solve a very clear function of viewing and the expansion of viewing the landscape and so on. And in doing this, we also got to experiment at the building level with something that has been our interest in research and teaching as well, in both SCI-Arc and UCLA, which had to do with composites. Another level of plasticity where the material itself is something that you actually can make. And of course, there are much more expressive and interesting aspects of this. And in other forms where you can change the material properties and change the finishes from coarse to from coarse to smooth. But in this case, it was an interesting way for us to test those things in the realm of a building where you have a steel structure and so on, and how those things will behave. So this is the interior without being finishes, and there's all this waffle, invert sort of waffle articulation that allows for both structuring these surfaces and reduce drastically the scale of the things, from the scale of the overall mass down to the scale of a body in these very particular areas, which are these underneaths of the surfaces. So it's a very, very, very conscious experiment in trying to, to decrease that scale in order to almost allow a certain tactility of a brush of a building that otherwise is, behaves in a very smooth way, especially at an area where you can almost grab these surfaces as you're approaching the landscape and the exterior. So this thing collaborates with the steel structure in a way, although the steel structure so self-behaves in terms of this is a cantilever of 10 by 8 meters, which is rather large and not so easy to do. So mass also deals with gradients and deals with the possibilities of changing, the behavior of masses when there's like conflicting aspects of either low density or other situations, to attain with. In this case, and this is the last project, and it's a project that's actually in an advanced state of construction in Rosario, Argentina. It was really about like working not only with the mass, but also in the mass with the mass of a building that is rather slender. It's a 10-story housing project, developer-oriented, sort of mid-rise project for kind of either young couples or students to begin to distort the envelope, to challenge a little bit the building code that not allows projection outside the construction line of anything that is not a balcony or a surface, so volumes can really extend out. And it's a little bit of a dialogue with an earlier project we have done in the same neighborhood, right when I finished Columbia in 1998. So it's not a complete new project. It's a project that is, it takes these problems, not the idea of continuous surface that wraps around it, and the problem of public space in this very, very constrained housing environments, and do something that completely modifies the fabric of the city, where like all buildings are just simple extrusions, and ours is obviously another one of those. But it, within the sort of genre of balconies and the genre of this fabric, it expresses something completely different, and it engages repetition and engages sort of layering of it. But it does so by basically making allowing the mass to manifest a kind of change from the massing aspect of the project to the cantilevering of volume, to the swerving and then the changing of those volume towards a flat surface of the balcony, all in sort of one move that repeats itself and actually almost dematerializes the mass towards the corner, allowing for obviously relations towards the context and whatever goes on in the ground and all that, and in doing so, produces some kind of minor structural problems which are measured when you actually have to build these things. So this is a section super stratified, and then the sort of zones of pochette that then have to be taken on by each of the balconies. So as a kind of possibility of engender a kind of small private space that has a little bit of plasticity around it. And so the building is entirely, all the envelope and structure is entirely cast in concrete inside. Very similar tectonics as the other project in Rosario, the house, where the craftsmanship is not so, or at least the craftsmanship based on what we could have, this building could afford, was not incredibly refined. So you had to work with like a concrete that will allow you a certain level of editing and finishing. And the cement in Argentina is really dark, and we really wanted white concrete. So instead of white cement, we use white paint, and it actually works really well. And so the amount, there's a number of specification of these that allows to how to say that you're not really making curvatures, that these things behave in a sort of straight line way, and you have to translate all these things to another way, where like milling machines and CNC and all these things that are not part of a kind of lexicon, and we're interested in allowing our practice to kind of be, to attain the friction that these things imply, and the roughness of this is obviously an important aspect of it. So this is the upper level where the mass begins to kind of branches into the top and gets to a kind of a public terrace, which will be the only public space, the only common space of the apartments. There are 14 apartments, 2 per floor. This thing is obviously not finished yet, and it's under construction and so on. And then the sort of small apertures that allow for like more diagonal views as you see this thing. And then the kind of effect that this thing, when they project outside the construction line, and the sort of white washing also attains the brick, that if you live in Argentina, you sort of learn to hate, because it's just everywhere. So we wanted to, again, abstract a little bit the materiality, and some of those patches are going to be filled with white ceramic tiles, very, very small, to allow for different levels of materiality to exist in an almost super flat part. This is obviously not, the back facade is not really the big facade, and this is traditionally, and the front is where the thing expresses itself and opens up drastically towards the corner. And that's the sort of technology available. It's not,
there are other things as well, but that's actually a kind of common picture. And this is the thing as it actually expresses itself. So when the surface peels off, the inner parts of the balcony will take the only part of color, which will be a sort of soft gray. Also in ceramic tiles, that will allow a kind of a contrast between the sort of inner and outer skin, and contrast that is both color-based and material, because the inner thing will actually reflect a little bit, and the outside will clearly not. So you will not see that thing, which is white on white. It will actually be white on gray, and with obviously with some light, the building will express the kind of measure distortion that happens in the mass in a, hopefully in a more profound way, that begins to make things like this happen. And this as you look up, which is important to us to kind of measure the effects of this as it actually deals with perspectival views and pedestrian activity and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I think this is the last one. Thank you. About an hour. So,
is there any questions for Marcelo?
I think it's really interesting work, of course, and thanks for coming from LA and willing to show us your work. I'm really particularly actually interested in this aspect that, taking technologies and methods of construction to countries that are now still developing. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the process of bringing all this knowledge and new ideas and applying in a city like Rosario. And how was that equation of the systems of, tectonic systems?
I mean, it's a challenge, and because the technology, I wouldn't say, it's lying to say that it doesn't exist. It probably exists somewhere, but it's very, very far from the architectural field, and architectural industry. And us being not there, it's a decision we made, which is rather customize what exists to make it work your way, and not say, well, we're going to delay construction and decline interest until we find the perfect milling machine and all that to kind of like maybe potentially make a more refined project. So what it is basically a lesson on projective geometry to a carpenter, a welder, and a number of people that, including the client, that they think you're just trying to trick them, until basically, like I spent a whole afternoon working with a person that was actually a metal person, craftsman, to try and build this mold, which is based on all these things. I mean, basically what I did is just like a series of strings, so basically to show how this thing had to be made, because they were trying to eyeball it, and obviously, it wasn't working. So, I mean, it had been done in wood, and it had been done in wood in Argentina as well. It was not the first hyperbolic paraboloid to ever be built. Clearly, it doesn't happen quite a lot in the vertical aggregation like that, where balconies tend to be built like in very, always in the air. So the more simple they are, the more, especially now. It used to be more complex in neoclassical, pseudo-French, Italian style. So, we had to customize that. And so I think it has to do with, to us, in our experience, it's like a little bit about like us, kind of get yourself in the mat potentially, and like and just work with what you have to try and build your visions. We're, embedded doesn't mean that we will do anything. We're not that interested in that. Which is you have to force certain things to happen, and I think it depends on, I think knowing the technology available and the people and the craftsmanship, the possibilities helps a lot, and this is different in every situation. But we can do it there because we are from there. Like we haven't done it in China, let's say. One could say like this thing was built in Shanghai with like cutting-edge technology, with the same people that built the interior of Saha's Guangzhou Opera House. So we were actually dealing with. We were really lucky because that thing was like by far the most expensive building in all the campus, and so
And the same thing with the project in Hollywood, which is that facade costs more per square feet in elevation than some Frangheri's buildings. And I'm not proud of it. The client is certainly not proud of it, but so it's a different situation. And I think as an architect, if you want to build or if you want to navigate the context of practice, you have to learn to at least predict these things. No? But I don't know. I think it's an interesting process to go through, especially when the technology is not there.
Maybe I just ask one closing question, which I think is concerning, I guess, maybe a lot of the young practitioners that we know from the West Coast. I think maybe one of the defining features of your office in particular is the change, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years that we've started to witness some of these projects actually being implemented. And I think it would be really interesting, I think, for students here and also obviously a community who also try through prototyping, through installations, in a certain sense, to formalize a certain form of materiality, but in a certain sense limited to a kind of conceptual manifestation. I think it would be really interesting to get your kind of more straightforward experience about how the nature and the constructive act of building has changed your office from more speculative competitions, I think, to basically working similar to the previous question, with a kind of constraints of very different contexts, with very different kinds of knowledges of building technology. I'm just kind of curious where the work is going at this stage, which seems that it's at that moment now where it's taking on board varied scales and varied contexts.
Yes.
It would be nice if we could hear a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's meant a little bit of a challenge at some point to actually begin to incorporate these things, both obviously in the formulation of the project, in the design, the ideas, the writing, and also in the teaching environments, which means to take a somewhat of an adversarial point of view with many of your colleagues and your friends, especially in the context of a school like SCI-Arc, which, again, obviously there's a lot of familiarity with places like SCI-Arc and the AA, and but also a lot of local situations where like, at least in SCI-Arc, many schools in the US context, images had sort of taken on this life of themselves, that they are no longer discussed as, with a certain distance as representations, but they are discussed as, facts and actuality, especially when it comes to tectonics, materiality. And this has nothing to do really with the question of, how radical something can be, or how, conventional is one should be, or like, this is obviously has to do with personal interest, but more to the question that if there's no any kind of, if architecture or if media is used only to produce just a certain kind of imagery that is devoid of any relation to physical matter, it's a different game that I think it has to be played in a different area. And personally, I'm not interested in being part of that in the context of an architectural school. And I've been kind of quite adamant in making these points and in forcing or instigating students to try and not build, just let's say, leave the computer and build models, because that would be outrageous and would be radical and would be foolish, but to try and instigate certain constraints built on modeling, built on expressing color, tectonic, seams, but also constraints on even like the sort of basic handling of like material that allows some relation between physical matter and sort of virtual material, let's say. And when I'm talking about virtual material, I'm including 3D prints and including all the sort of stuff that at this point is no longer innovative and is no longer really material per se. Still a lot of dust physicalized in three-dimensional form. Because I believe otherwise it becomes a little bit, A, I think it's just too easy. B, I think architects become illustrators. And I think as illustrators, there are probably lots of other people who actually have better capabilities. Many of them are actually in our vicinity in Hollywood. And I think, my take is being like, if we want to train these people, well, let's be it, but let's call it different. I think there's certain agencies and certain processes within the discipline
that should be defined in a different way. And I think this thing evolved quite a lot, let's say, from the years that I was at Columbia in 96, 97, and it's already been like, it's going to be 20 years. It's already 20 years probably since the whole thing, or at least started. So I think it's maybe taken a little bit lightly sometimes. So it's not easy because obviously when you do competitions and when you do projects in the context of school, unless you're doing like installations or seminars which are more technology oriented, the most you can make is model, but forcing models to appear early or forcing things to kind of be at least made friction with other things, including models and including the act of assembly, I think is obviously an important part. Not to be like, like Manuel de Landa says, like meet material halfway, which is a different thing, in terms of like using optimization and so on, which is a valid thing. It's not something we're interested in, but to mean that the material exists, within the realm, even if you're trying to build the most weirdest thing in the world. So I don't know if that answers the question, but